democracies in Europe, for instance, or Australia, New Zealand, that have religious symbols on their flag and that have preferential immigration policies for members of the dominant ethnic group. So my point is that Zionism is wrestling with a tension that also exists in Palestinian nationalism, and indeed exists in different ways in nationalism in many countries. Not the United States so much, but certainly in the nationalism of European countries, especially in Eastern Europe, for instance. And if you accept that Palestinian nationalism can be legitimate even as it wrestles with this tension, not all forms of Palestinian nationalism, not Islamic Jihad's form of Palestinian nationalism, but some form of Palestinian nationalism, then I think you also have to accept that there can be some form of Zionism that can wrestle with this tension and can be legitimate, at least if there is a Palestinian state alongside it, right? So then if Palestinian citizens inside Israel don't have all of the rights of their Jewish neighbors, there is a Palestinian state next door that does give Palestinians national rights, and then the question is how to have as many rights as possible for minorities in both of these states, and that there probably would be some Jewish minority in the Palestinian state as well. Again, I'm not saying this to excuse Israel as it exists in 2015, which I think infringes on Palestinian rights in the most blatant and brutal ways. And I'm not saying this to suggest that that the settlements have any legitimacy or to justify what I think has been the effect to undermine the rights of Palestinian citizens inside the state of Israel. But to me, the kind of Zionism that I think can be in reasonable tension with liberal democracy is the kind of Zionism that Yitzhak Rabin was moving towards in the mid-1990s. Not only when he had a peace process that was moving towards Palestinian statehood, but also because he was doing things internally inside the state of Israel. For instance, equalizing childhood allowances between Jews and Palestinian citizens, instituting affirmative action inside the state of Israel for Palestinian citizens in the civil service, and making an arrangement with Palestinian political parties, the only time this has ever happened, to give them essentially de facto participation in his governing coalition. That's the kind of Zionism that I think one can see to be in some reasonable tension. There's still a tension with liberal democracy. But I have to acknowledge that the kind of Zionism that we see today under Benjamin Netanyahu and Naftali Bennett is pretty far from that. The reason I think this is important to say, though, is that if you believe that these are two people that have strong national yearnings and no real interest in abandoning those national yearnings for some kind of supranational, secular, binational state, that has a big impact on what you think would happen if there were a secular, binational state. I mean, you could create a country called Israelstein, but if its people identify as Jews and Palestinians and not as members of Israelstein, then the army of Israelstein is essentially rival militias under a common flag and under conditions of intense stress. And this will be conditions of enormous stress, right? In a one-state reality, you will have land claims throughout the state of Israel from Palestinians who claim that their families had deed or keys to this land originally. You would have to imagine that the Jewish judge of Israelstein decrees that the Jewish family that's been living there since they came from Morocco in 1951 has to leave because Palestinians are going to now live there, or vice versa, that they're not going to leave, and that when the fighting breaks out, that the joint Jewish-Palestinian Brigade of Israelstein is going to hold together because their loyalty to Israelstein will supersede their loyalty to Jewish or Palestinian. That's why I'm very pessimistic about the idea of a secular binational state. Secular binationalism barely works in Belgium. Doesn't have a great track record. The Czechs and the Slovaks couldn't make it work. Now, one might say, well, look, Beinart, given that you are speaking from a privileged position here, being an American Jew who has an interest as a Jew, and I freely admit that, I'm not a pure universalist, I am a member of the people, the Jewish people, it's very convenient for you to say that this would not be workable. But I would just say in my defense, I'm not the only one who takes that position. If you look at the interview, for instance, that Marwan Barghouti, perhaps the most popular Palestinian politician alive, gave last year to Al Monitor, he said, the reason we need the two-state solution is because the alternative to this two-state solution is never-ending war based on an existential crisis. You don't have to be operating from a Zionist position in which you have a stake in Jewish statehood to believe, in fact, that on pragmatic grounds, this might be the best outcome given the desires of both people. So let me just end by talking about what I think a third narrative might be, since that's part of what this effort is about. A third narrative would acknowledge that, would disagree with the anti-Zionist position, which believes that Zionism is inherently immoral and unworkable, and disagree with the establishment view that sees Zionism as self-justifying. It would say Zionism can be immoral or moral depending on what it looks like on the ground and depending on how close it comes to respecting liberal democratic principles for all people under its domain. And compared to how good a job it does at securing those rights compared to the other alternatives that we can imagine. Now, to be honest, I think the people who believe in this third position are weaker than the forces in Camp 1 or 2, and I think we're growing even weaker. We're growing weaker, most of all, because the Zionism Israel is creating on the ground is more and more illiberal. The occupation has become ever more permanent. The assault on the rights of Palestinian citizens inside the Green Line is growing stronger and stronger, along with the rights of those Jews who are dissidents in their own country. And the more Israeli Jews accept and foment these trends, and the more Palestinians react to them, the more camps 1 and 2 grow, and the harder it is to offer any third alternative. So how could this potentially be turned around, especially given that for those of us who live here in the United States and not in Israel or Palestine? I'll offer a couple of suggestions. The first one is particularly applies to the American Jewish community. I think we need an all-out assault on the idea that it is acceptable to go to Israel with the desire to try to understand it better and never speak to Palestinians. This is the dominant reality for synagogue trips, federation trips, birthright, and it's a reality that has been foisted upon the American political class because when American Jewish organizations like AIPAC and others take members of Congress to the West Bank, they never encounter Palestinians either. Maybe they might have a meeting with Abbas where they can be instructed to yell at him for all the things he's doing wrong, but they never actually encounter ordinary Palestinians talking about their lives. I think this is pathological. I think it's a recipe for dehumanization. Talking endlessly about people without ever talking to them is a recipe for destroying, for not appreciating their humanity. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And the reason I think this is so important is, and I've seen this from many, many people who I know, I genuinely believe that a day, or even half a day, of actual interaction with Palestinians in the West Bank, or even Palestinians inside the state of Israel, Palestinians who do not appear to be pathologically driven to kill Jews simply because that's the way they're genetically programmed. Palestinians who can speak articulately, maybe even with a sense of irony and humor, about what it's like to live every day in a country in which you are not a citizen, to be at the mercy of a state over which you have no control, right? Jews can relate to these things, right? We understand at some deep level what that's like. I think that experience can destabilize an entire lifetime of establishment Zionist propaganda in a very short space of time, because it's the encountering of a human reality that you have not had access to your whole life. And we need to make people who go to Israel and come back and never meet Palestinians and claim to speak with authority about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we need to make that as absurd as the idea that you would travel to New York City on a study tour to understand relationships between African Americans and the police and stay in Manhattan and never venture north of 110th Street. It's patently absurd. And yet we accept this absurdity as the norm inside our community, and that has to change. And there are some really good organizations that are trying to change that and need to be supported. The second thing that I think we need to do is we need to try to influence the Bernie Sanders campaign. The reason is this. The nature of the campaign discourse about Israel-Palestine this year has been horrible, absolutely appalling. I'm not just talking about the Republicans. The Republicans have basically fallen into various camps. One camp says that Israel should have permanent control over Palestinians who lack basic rights. The other camp says that Israel should forcibly remove them somewhere else. And the third camp says it doesn't really matter because there are no Palestinians at all. They don't exist, right? I mean, this is the Republican debate. But what's more disturbing to me, and I have an essay coming out about this in Haaretz in a couple weeks, is actually what Hillary Clinton is saying. I mean, what Hillary Clinton is saying is, to me, really astonishing. I mean, she put out a statement in the midst of the violence that did not acknowledge that any Palestinians had died. She said in an interview with Jeff Goldberg that she totally understood why Benjamin Netanyahu believed that Israel should control the Jordan Valley indefinitely, permanently, essentially. And she said recently in a statement that got very little attention that until Syria is solved, and you know what's going to happen in Jordan, we can't really talk seriously about the idea of a Palestinian state because we have to wait until the Middle East stabilizes, right? As if holding millions of people without basic rights is going to be a recipe for stability. But that's Benjamin Netanyahu's line. That's not Barack Obama's line. That's not Bill Clinton's line. That's Benjamin Netanyahu's line that she is now parroting. And the reason that Bernie Sanders is so important is that Bernie Sanders can put pressure on her because she is not where the Democratic base voters are. You see how he's pushing her to the left on issue after issue. But on this issue, she is being allowed to run as far right as Chaim Saban wants her to run. And if Bernie Sanders were actually to raise this issue, first of all, it would help his campaign because that's where his supporters actually are, right? But it would also force Hillary to react, and it would change the dynamic, it would change the record we have from the campaign in case she gets elected. Now, Bernie Sanders, for reasons I do not really genuinely understand, doesn't seem very comfortable talking about this issue. I don't really, know. Maybe he thinks that once the Marxist revolution comes, that will solve Israel-Palestine too. I don't know. He doesn't feel, anything that's not in a purely class analysis just seems to make him a little bit uncomfortable. But I think he needs to get over that discomfort level because I actually think it's very, very important. And it will be important for a Hillary Clinton presidency. And the last thing I think we need to do is to try to convince the Obama administration that the position that they currently have, which is that basically because we had this big fight with the Netanyahu government over Iran, that now we have to make nice with them and throw the Palestinians under the bus and not support anything at the UN is absolutely wrong. First of all, it is just morally wrong to basically make the Palestinians pay the price for the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu fought the United States over Iran. And the two issues are separate. And beyond that, what we're seeing in the violence that's breaking out now shows you what happens when there is despair, when there is no prospect for any positive movement. I think that this violence maybe can help the administration reconsider this view that they just want to throw in the towel now until the end of Barack Obama's presidency, because I think they do. It's more likely they're going to be trying to manage these terrifying outbreaks of violence that are happening every day. So I think they have an opportunity maybe to push the administration to recalculate its position on going to the UN and supporting some kind of Palestinian state that recognizes Israel and calls for a Palestinian state alongside the 1967 line. We certainly don't know that that would stop the cycle of violence, but it would at least give some people some cause for hope, which they now utterly lack, and it would give Barack Obama some kind of legacy to be able to say, I put down a marker here about the vision that I would like to see as Bill Clinton did. And I'll just end by saying that we're in a few weeks going to reach Hanukkah, which is the time that Jews celebrate the creation of a Jewish state 2,000 years ago. And it's very important as people despair of this issue and want to ignore it and want to focus on other things because it's so depressing, to recognize that if the things continue in their current course, we will probably in our lifetimes, many of us, be celebrating a Hanukkah during which point we see the destruction of a Jewish state. The Hanukkah is not only the story of the creation of a Jewish state. That Jewish state died. It died in large part because of its moral corruption, right? That can happen again. Our parents and grandparents were a Jewish generation that had the good fortune to be present at the birth of the first Jewish state in 2,000 years. It is entirely possible, even probable, that we will be the Jewish generation that is present at the destruction of a Jewish state. Because I deeply believe that in the long term, a non-democratic Israel is a dead Israel. The West Bank is a colonial project, and over the long term, you cannot maintain a colonial project in a post-colonial world. If Israeli democracy dies, Israel dies. And then we have to face the reality that we were there We were present at this moment in history when the first Jewish state in 2,000 years died. Those are the stakes, and that's why I think this is important. Thanks.
3 minutes? 5 minutes? What should we do?
Let's take three questions in a row, and then let Peter respond.
Okay, we're going to take 4 because I have the first one.
Okay. 4 questions in a row, and then let Peter respond.
All right. You don't need to answer this, Peter, but I'm hoping JJ and I can answer it, and we can think about this later. One of the premises of the pro-Israel, pro-peace camp since Bibi was elected the first time, it's 96, has been no Israeli prime minister can jeopardize Israel's most important security relationship by snubbing an American president. And that's why Shamir supposedly lost, one of the reasons, and therefore America has leverage. Well, we've seen an Israeli prime minister openly insulting an American president for almost 8 years now, over and over again, and his poll numbers keep going up, or didn't change. So what do we do with that now? What do we do with that relationship and how it's changed? Does it limit America's power to do anything? So that's the first question. Now we can get 3 more. Yeah.
Peter, you spoke, I think, very of the likelihood that your generation, perhaps not mine, will see the death of the Zionist dream is what I call it. You didn't talk about the alternative, which I think is the A word that everybody, no one wants to use, and that's apartheid. And it seems to me that the alternative to a democratic Israel is an apartheid Israel. And I'm wondering what you think that will do to the international standing of Israel in terms of its support to the American public, both Jewish and non-Jewish.
Yes,
This is a question. What would you say to a leading Palestinian intellectual who rejects the current Palestinian leadership, who thinks that there is no Israeli left that's politically viable, who thinks that the only solution for the Palestinians is the development of an indigenous Palestinian movement, and the only way to develop an indigenous Palestinian movement is to hold out the option for a binational state, and he sees the BDS movement as an example of a possibility.
Do you have any thoughts on, I believe New Zealand has some proposal for the UN, and I'm wondering if you have an opinion on that.
Okay, great. So I'll just try to focus off and not go on too long. Dan, I think you're right. I mean, the Obama administration, I think, did come in with the idea based on what happened with George H.W. Bush and Shamir, and also maybe with Clinton and Bibi when Bibi was prime minister in the late 90s, that an Israeli prime minister couldn't, once the Israeli public recognized the Israeli prime minister had lost the confidence of an American president, that would produce a political reaction in Israel. And it didn't happen. Now, partly maybe because Israelis were from the very beginning hostile to Barack Obama. Now, you can argue that it's because Obama didn't play his cards right, because he didn't go to Israel, he went to Cairo instead. You can also argue that the polls showed that a lot of Israeli Jews thought Barack Obama was a Muslim from the very beginning and assumed that he was anti-Palestinian, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli. Whatever the reasons, I think that assumption was wrong, you're right. But I also think it's important to recognize that when Benjamin Netanyahu, the political dynamic in Israel is based on this reality. Benjamin Netanyahu repeatedly snubs Barack Obama and pays no price for it, right? Now, that's a lot better if you're Benjamin Netanyahu dealing with your domestic audience than Benjamin Netanyahu snubs Barack Obama and pays a real price for it, right? He paid no price for it, right? Even on this Iran deal, right? I mean, they offer him, basically the world if he will not fight the Iran deal. He fights the Iran deal tooth and nail, and then they give him the same offer, right? You don't have to be Donald Trump to realize that maybe this isn't the best negotiating tactic, right? So obviously Barack Obama didn't want to make Israel pay any price for opposing what he wanted to do with Palestinians in Iran because he didn't want to deal with the domestic political pressure fight here in the United States. And I think that part of what groups like J Street and others need to do is over time they need to be able to change that political dynamic. But it's important to remember that I think the political reality in Israel would have been different if the Israelis had seen that they were actually paying a price for Benjamin Netanyahu's actions. In fact, they didn't, which I think is part of what's fueled this just astonishing arrogance that you see from Netanyahu and Dermer in the way they think they can treat the United States. They have good reason to be arrogant, given the track record. On the question of apartheid, I'm loath to use the word apartheid, even to describe the West Bank. I don't think it's accurate vis-a-vis Israel to the Green Line. It's more accurate in the West Bank, but the reason I don't use it is I feel like actually it then, the entire conversation becomes about the correctness of that terminology, and there are important differences between even the West Bank and a part of South Africa. And so I guess what I would say is for people, is that the point, what I try to do is not to use the words, but just to describe some facts about the reality of Palestinian life. It seems to me you can't argue that Palestinians live under the control of Israel without citizenship, under